In our study of Proverbs today, we're in Proverbs chapter 31. Proverbs chapter 31 has to do with the virtuous woman. Now, what does it mean to be a virtuous woman? Well, some translations say thrifty, some say devoted, some say chaste, moral, dependable, capable. In the last verse, or next to the last verse, it says that the virtuous woman fears the Lord, fears God. And at the end of Ecclesiastes, Solomon said the whole duty of man was to fear God and keep his commandments. So the virtuous woman fears God, she keeps God's commandments. Nowadays, she would be a Christian, she would be a follower of the Lord Jesus Christ. She would live a life of love and a life of service. Now, in the book of Proverbs, it has a lot to say about the immoral woman, about the woman who has no morals, the adulterous woman, the woman whose paths lead down to death. And then in chapter 31, we have that contrasted with the virtuous woman. Might think for a moment, in the Bible, can you think of some virtuous women? Well, I can think of a few. I can think of Ruth. She certainly was a virtuous woman. I can think of Esther. I can think of, all of a sudden now her name deserts me, but she was the female judge, Deborah. I can think of Deborah. In the New Testament, I can think of Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. Think of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Think about Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla seems like she certainly was a virtuous woman. At the end of the book of Romans, Paul mentions a lot of women that helped him. And we have a lot of virtuous women in this church. I married a virtuous woman 52 years ago, and I tell you, a young man who looks for a mate better not just look at looks, better look at the inside, better look for a virtuous woman. You'll be greatly blessed because of that. Jeanette and I used to be involved with the bereavement committee, where when there would be a funeral, we would help prepare the meal. And all the women that helped with that, I would say they were virtuous women. And there were women just, you could count on them every time to bring food, to take time out of their busy schedule to prepare food and to bring it for the funeral. So we have a lot of virtuous women in this church. Now, Solomon, I don't know if Solomon wrote these verses here in Proverbs 31 or not, but whether he did, Solomon was an expert on women. He probably knew more about women than anybody before or since. He had 700 wives and he had 300 concubines. And I wonder, in all those women, did Solomon have at least one virtuous woman? I don't know if he did or not. I imagine that Solomon picked his wives on the basis of their beauty or on the basis of forming a political partnership with a foreign country. So I don't know if he did or not, but Solomon has some things in Proverbs to say about women. In Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 22, he says, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. Solomon probably was surrounded by beautiful women, but if they didn't show discretion, he says that's just like putting a jewel in the nose of a pig. And then in Proverbs 27 and verse 15, he says, a quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping on a rainy day. Restraining her is like restraining the wind or grasping oil with the hand. So Solomon probably had a lot of experiences along those lines. And then in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 9, he says, better to live on a corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife. And in Proverbs 25 and 24, he makes the same statement. Well, beauty is only skin deep. And in Proverbs chapter 31, at the end in verse 30, it says, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Beauty is only skin deep, and with age, beauty passes away. Over in 1 Peter chapter 3 with verse 3, speaking to wives, he says, "Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight." Now notice the writer says that the beauty of the inner self is unfading beauty. We know that outer beauty fades, and our society puts a great deal of emphasis on outer beauty. Billions of dollars are spent every year in cosmetics and so on, and some people, movie stars and so on, when they see themselves getting old, they go to plastic surgery and they go to injections and so on, and they ruin their looks. Dolly Parton, now I'm not trying to make fun of Dolly Parton. I like her, and she sings a song, "When I Sing for Him," great song. But what Dolly Parton has done to her face, if they made another Batman movie and they needed a female Joker, she could play the part and she wouldn't need much makeup. And I've noticed just recently they've started in on men. There's advertisements now, you can buy some kind of a rubber thing and you chew on it and that firms your chin up. And we're not supposed to be happy with our chin. We're supposed to, I think we ought to have better things to worry about than whether we have a firm chin or not. A lot of times we notice the movie stars and the models and so on, they have a real hard time having a marriage that lasts all the time. You read about divorces and so on. And this is probably because their beauty's on the outside, not the inside. And they have a lot of selfishness and they have a lot of pride. Now, it used to be, maybe it still is, but it used to be that motherhood was highly prized and highly exalted. Back during the Civil War, there was a song, "Just Before the Battle, Mother." And that song said, "Just before the battle, mother, I am thinking most of you, while upon the hills we're watching with the enemy in view." And he says, I'm surrounded by my soldier friends, and we're filled with thoughts of home and God, because on the morrow we know that some of us will sleep beneath the sod. And I've heard that soldiers in the Civil War and maybe World War II, when they were wounded very badly, that they would cry out for their mother. And there used to be a lot of songs about mother. Jimmie Rogers, probably the first country western singer, he lived about 100 years ago. He sang a lot of songs about mother, and I remember one song, he's getting out of prison, and he says he's going to go home to his mother, and he's going to walk the straight line, and he's going to stay out of trouble. And then Merle Haggard, about 50 years ago, he sang the song, "Mama Tried." And he says, "I turned 21 in prison, doing life without parole. No one could set me right, but Mama tried. Mama tried to raise me better, but her pleadings I denied." And so he says, "I have nobody to blame but myself, because Mama tried." Now, I haven't exactly kept up with the new songs, but I don't recall any new song about motherhood and about mother. And I think possibly one reason for that is our society tells women that if you're a homemaker, if your full attention is given to your husband and family, you're a failure. You need to get out of the home and you need to have a career. And women do, and a lot of times they find then that they don't have a family. And it's a shame, but so many women today, if pregnancy is inconvenient for them, then they will get an abortion. And they have demonstrations and so on about the right to abortion, and that public tax money should be used to pay for their abortion. Now, we look back in history. I look at Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln was 9 years old, his mother, her name was Nancy Hanks, she dies. And for about a year, Abraham was a very lonely little boy. Abraham's father's name was Thomas, and Thomas was not very good to the boy. As far as Thomas was concerned, the only value Abraham had was in putting him to work. And if Thomas didn't have work for Abraham to do, Thomas would hire Abraham out to neighbors. And of course, Thomas would get the money. But then after about a year, Thomas got remarried. He married a woman by the name of Sarah Bush. And while Nancy had been content to let Thomas do whatever he wanted to, when Thomas married Sarah Bush, he found things changed. Sarah Bush saw greatness in that little boy, and she encouraged him. And Abraham had a strong desire to learn, and Thomas thought that was foolishness, and he made fun of the boy. But Sarah stood up for little Abraham, and she told Thomas, go do something useful. And she encouraged him. And of course, later on, when our country had the Civil War and the greatest conflict, the greatest that we've ever had, there was Abraham Lincoln. And he saved the Union and he freed the slaves. And I remember one prominent historian talking about how hard that would have been to do. And he said, Abraham Lincoln did it. Nobody else could have done it. And I don't think Abraham Lincoln would have been prepared, would have done what he did if it wasn't for his mother. Well, let's take a look now at Proverbs chapter 31, beginning with verse 10, where it talks about the virtuous woman. And it says, who can find a virtuous woman? She is far more precious than jewels. Money will buy a lot of things, but money won't buy a virtuous woman. And a lot of times guys that are wealthy, they'll marry a beautiful woman, but sometimes the beautiful woman just wants his money. And but he talks here about the blessing to have a virtuous woman for a wife. It says she's priceless. And then verse 11, the heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will not lack anything good. Now, I've never had this experience, but I know that a lot of husbands and wives do not trust each other. And a lot of times they're not faithful to each other. I've seen like on magazine covers where it says 5 ways to know if your spouse is cheating. And sometimes the spouse will hire a private detective to follow the other one and see if, they're cheating or not. Well, life is filled with enough stress besides having to worry about whether your spouse is being loyal to you or not. And it says the heart of her husband trusts in her. He trusts her. He will not lack anything good. Now, some wives and some husbands too, they can't handle money. And the only time they're happy is when they're spending money, and they go deep in debt and they run up a huge debt on the credit card. And men can do that as well as women. Now, I've been very blessed because this is the honest truth. I don't know how much money we have in the bank. I don't know how much money we get every month. I don't know how much our bills are. Jeanette did some accounting before we got married, and she took over it. And I've always made the money, and she's always taken care of it, and we've always had enough. And that's been very stress-free for me. I can totally trust her. If we are going to make a big purchase, we talk about it and we come to a decision. And so the husband trusts in her. He will not lack anything good. And then in verse 12, she rewards him with good, not evil, all the days of her life. So this virtuous woman that a man is blessed to be married to, she gives him good and not evil, as long as they're married. Well, some wives don't. I know a situation where there were husband and wife, and the wife had an affair, and the husband forgave her, and then the wife decided she wanted a college education, so the husband paid for her to go through college, and then the day after she graduated, she presented her husband with divorce papers, and then she dragged the divorce out to squeeze him for every single penny she could. He had started a business, and she had nothing to do with that business. All she did was spend his money. She was lazy. He, for example, had to iron his own clothes. He did some of the cooking, but she just squeezed him for every penny she could. And she certainly was not a virtuous woman. And I don't know how she could do that and have any kind of a conscience at all. But the virtuous woman rewards her husband with good, not evil. And then verse 13, she selects wool and flax and works with willing hands. Now this might be kind of a surprise, but back then, we're talking about like maybe 3,000 years ago, you couldn't go to Belle's and buy clothes. The wife made the clothes for the family. And so here, this virtuous woman, she takes wool. And of course, wool comes from sheep, and she would make yarn out of it or thread, and then she would weave that into cloth. And then she would take flax. Flax is a plant that has long fibers, and they can be twisted together to make strong thread. And flax is used to make linen. And linen was a smooth material, and whereas wool is very itchy, linen was not. And so she weaves clothes for her family. And not only does she work making clothes for her family, but verse 14, she is like the merchant ships, bringing her food from far away. Merchant ships, probably from all over the Mediterranean Sea, brought food to Israel. And this woman, she would go out and shop, and maybe she would go to distant shops, and she would get varied and high quality food for her family. And one thing that's always amazed me about Jeanette is we have never run out of food. I mean, we never run out of milk, we never run out of peanut butter, we never run out of graham crackers, never run out of bread. I go shopping with her, but she makes the list, and I don't know how she does it, but we never run out of anything. And then verse 15, she rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and portions for her female servants. So she's tireless in her work ethic, and she gets up before the sun comes up, and she begins to work preparing food while the rest of the household sleeps. And she provides food for her female servants. She serves the servants. And then verse 16, she evaluates a field and buys it. She plants a vineyard with her earnings. Now we'll read in a few verses that the cloth and the clothes and so on that she makes more than her family needs, and so she sells them. So she has money, and here she buys a field and she plants a vineyard. And then verse 17, she draws on her strength and reveals that her arms are strong. Now she's doing 4 huge tasks at once. She's maintaining a home, she's running a textile business, she's running an agricultural enterprise with the vineyard, and in a few verses we'll read that she helps the poor. And it says she draws on her strength. Well, I tell you what, this woman probably is the twin sister to Superman because of everything she does. And we'll see more of that in just a few minutes. Verse 18, she sees that her profits are good and her lamps never goes out at night. What does it mean, her lamp never goes out at night? I asked Jeanette what that meant, and she said, well, the lady pays her electric bill. Well, they didn't have electricity back then. I think what it means is she works way late into the night. Now, a long time ago, I worked at the mines, and when I did day shift, I had to get up way before sunup. And I went to bed early. And most of us need a certain amount of sleep. Evidently, this woman didn't need much sleep. I know a woman here in town that needs about 3 hours of sleep a night, and she gets a lot accomplished, but most of us need more than that. So anyway, this woman, she gets up very early in the morning and she works late at night. Verse 19, she extends her hands to the spinning staff and her hands hold the spindle. This is probably what she did at night. She was making the wool and the flax into thread, into yarn. And back then they didn't have spinning wheels like more modern women did. They had a spinning staff and a spindle. And then verse 20, her hands reach out to the poor and she extends her hands to the needy. So she takes care of her family, she cooks for her family, she shops for her family, she makes clothes for her family, but then she's also concerned with the poor and she helps them. And then verse 21, she is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all in her household are doubly clothed. Now some translations, instead of doubly clothed, they say they're clothed in scarlet. Now scarlet was a dye that was highly prized, and it came from the eggs of a parasitic insect that infested certain oak trees. And so if their clothes were scarlet, that means they were very special. If they were doubly clothed, that makes sense. It says when it snows, because when it snows, when it gets cold, she's not concerned about her family because she knows that they are well dressed and they won't feel the cold. And then verse 22, she makes her own bed coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Now in Proverbs 7 and verse 16, we read that the wayward woman bought her bed coverings from Egypt. But here now, this woman, the bed coverings that she makes for her husband and her wife for the bed, she makes those. And it says it's fine linen and purple. Purple was a dye that came from certain shellfishes that were found in the Mediterranean waters. And then verse 23, her husband is known at the city gates, where he sits among the elders of the land. So this virtuous wife was a credit to the husband, and she took a lot of weight and a lot of concern off her husband. And at the city gates, that's where, that would be like the judges and the city council and the mayor. That's where they would meet. And so her husband was well known and well respected, pretty much because of her. And then verse 24, she makes and sells linen garments. She delivers belts to the merchants. So not only does she provide for her family, she has extra that she sells. And then verse 25, strength and honor are her clothing, and she can laugh at the time to come. Now, Christians, we today, we can laugh at the time to come because we know no matter what misfortune this life has for us, we have eternal life. And this woman could laugh at the time to come because she had sons that loved her and respected her. And she knew that when the time came that she would get old and feeble, that her sons would take her in and they would provide for her. So she had the basis for a future. And then verse 27, she watches over the activities of her household and is never idle. Oh, let's see, I skipped verse 26. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and loving instruction is on her tongue. She opens her mouth, and what comes out? Well, it's not gossip. It's not slander about somebody. What comes out was wisdom. She was the woman that when she spoke, she had something to say, and people would listen to her. And then she had loving instruction. She raised her children. She was concerned with her children, and she instructed them, and she instructed them with love. And then verse 27, she watches over the activities of her household and is never idle. So she has a lot of things going on in her life, but her household is a very high priority to her. And then verse 28, her sons rise up and call her blessed. So she has grown sons, and they, now that they're grown, they appreciate her. They appreciate the wise instruction that she gave to them. They appreciate the food that she cooked for them, the clothes she made for them, the loving service that she gave to them. And so they call her blessed. And then it says her husband also praises her. And he says, many women are capable, but you surpass them all. So she has a husband who loves and who appreciates her for what she has done. And then verse 30, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord will be praised. I knew a person one time who 1 minute could be just absolutely so charming, and then the next minute could be so hateful and so mean. And so charm's deceptive, beauty's fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord will be praised, and this virtuous woman praises the Lord. And then the last verse, give her the reward of her labor and let her works praise her at the city gates. So in Proverbs, it is talked a lot about the immoral woman, but now then it talks about the virtuous woman and the Christian woman. And like I said, we have many virtuous women in this church, and women have contributed considerable to our church, to our lives, to our country. So these are some things about the virtuous woman, and I think that I'm finished, so I think that I'll quit now that I am through.